Now, one of the reasons we're here today is because the Joint Centre has just very recently released a terrific report on housing for older adults in the United States, and that's the catalyst for the event. But one of the things that was terrific about the report was it not only included the sort of demographic and economic analyses that we have come to expect from the Joint Centre in its signature reports, such as State of the Nation's Housing, but because of the particular character of the needs and aspirations of older adults, it started to deal with issues at the local level. And so today we can actually dive even deeper into the planning, design, programming, and policy implications of the larger economic and demographic changes that we are facing in regards to aging. So we're actually thrilled to have we have a very diverse group of speakers, but we also have a very diverse audience, including folks from most of the universities across the Boston area, policy makers, advocates, and folks from the public and private sectors. Before I hand over to Chris Herbert to get started with today's proceedings, though, I would like to thank our sponsors for the event, including the Graduate School of Design, AARP Massachusetts. AARP Foundation sponsored the report, which you'll hear about from Chris, the Jewish Community Housing for the Elderly, CHAPA, and the MHCDC. As you'll see, we have an incredible group of speakers today, and you'll not only be able to listen to them and interact with them during the proceedings, but we're having a closing reception at the end of the formal part of this event, and you'll get a chance to talk with the panelists and also, importantly, with each other. And finally, before I turn things over to Chris Herbert, who's going to present the Joint Centre's report, let me note that we are live webcasting, and we also encourage you to follow the event on Twitter with the hashtag @AgingAndPlace. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Anne is also the chair of our faculty committee, and we're very, very happy to be working with her. And she's been was instrumental in helping to guide this report along, so she herself had a role in it. I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the acting managing director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and I'm really glad to be able to welcome you all here today. We're really excited to be able to spend time studying such an important issue, and to be able to find a wider audience for it is really an important part of why we do these things. The report itself was able to generate an editorial in the New York Times, the Sunday New York Times, that points out the importance of the issue. And that's really our goal in raising these issues, but what's really important is the follow-up. And so what do we do about that? And our goal really in hosting this event today is to both extend that recognition of the issue, but then also begin a dialogue with people who are actually working on solutions and approaches that are needed. And I really hope that you find the two panels that we have today really helpful in thinking through those approaches. I also want to echo Anne in thanking our sponsors for the event. And particularly, I want to thank Mike Festa, the State Director of the Mass AARP, and Amy Scheckman, who is the Director of the Jewish Community Housing for the Elderly, both because they're joining us here today in the event and because they were also part of a group that helped us plan this event as well. So special thanks to both of them. So, and as Anne mentioned, we are trying to join the modern age. Harvard thinks that just because we're Harvard, the world will pay attention, but it turns out things like Twitter and the like really do make a difference. And so we're really hopeful that people will tweet to the Aging in Place hashtag. I myself haven't yet figured out how to tweet, but they're working on me. So let me turn to the report. One of the questions folks were talking about who are on the panel today was, well, how is it that you came to take on these issues? And this, obviously, the Joint Center, our stock and trade, is looking at demographic issues and understanding those trends that are important for housing. And there's probably no trend that's going to be more important over the next several decades than the aging of society and its implication for housing. And so when we got a grant from the AARP Foundation to be able to do a deeper dive on these issues, we were really thrilled. There are many challenges of aging, and those challenges relate to being able to maintain your health and your physical security, to maintain engage with your family, friends, and community, and to remain productive members of society. And the construct that we used in the report to think about the role of housing in this is that housing is really the linchpin to the well-being of people. It's true certainly of people as they age. It's true throughout the life cycle, but I think a number of factors as we age in terms of the financial challenges and the physical challenges that arise make housing even more central to the well-being of households. On the one hand, it's certainly central to financial security. You think about the affordability of housing and whether you can afford the housing you're in and implications if you can't on the rest of your life. If you think about the fact that home ownership represents such a significant portion of wealth for most people and how important that is late in life. And you think about the physical security, whether or not the home you're in keeps you safe and secure and is adapted to your physical needs. And then there's the issue of social connections. Is your house situated in a way that allows you to maintain your social connections, to access the services that you need, and to maintain involvement with your community? Where your house is located and how it connects to transit systems is incredibly important for this. And then finally, whether or not it provides linkages to long-term supports and services at that phase of life when you do need more supports to be able to stay in your home and maintain living independently. And in each of these areas, we face really significant challenges going forward and thinking about how well prepared we are to house people. Certainly in terms of financial security, we've had housing affordability is worse than it's ever been. And we're seeing more people entering retirement with mortgage debt, and so undermining the ability of home ownership to provide that wealth that's so important. In terms of physical security, there's really a great shortage of accessible units. And that trade-off of spending for housing that you need also has implications for your physical well-being in terms of how much you're spending on food, on health care, and other things. And in terms of social connections, there's certainly deficiencies in housing options in terms of being housing that's centrally located and near to community centers, whether or not you have the pedestrian infrastructure you need, whether you have the pedestrian infrastructure, even if you're located near those city centers, all of which raise the risk of isolation. And then finally, there's disconnects between housing programs and healthcare systems. So the report is intended to look at each of these phases and take stock of where we're at and highlight the areas where we need to pay more attention. To begin with, we look at the demographics just to paint a portrait of where we are in terms of aging. This chart shows the population in 3 age groups that we use in the report as a way to organize our thinking about older households. We look at people 50 to 64, that pre-retirement age span, as people are preparing for that period of life when they'll leave the workforce or may leave the workforce. And then 65 to 79, the first phase of retirement. And then finally those 80 and over, the oldest old, where many of the challenges really become most acute. And what you can see from this is you can see that wave of baby boomers as they're moving through these age groups. So beginning at about 1990, the first boomers started to turn 50, and over the last 2 decades, we've seen that 50-plus population really grow, and now has basically leveled off. So we're just, as of 2011, when the first baby boomers turned 65, starting to see that 65 and over population really grow. So we're going to go from 29 million in 2010 to 43 million in 2020. So a huge increase over the span of just 1 decade, and then to 53 million by 2030. So we're at a point now where that baby boom wave is really moving into that 65 to 79-year age group. And I think, as we'll see, the challenges here are more financial in terms of a period of time when incomes are declining and whether or not you're able to afford the housing that you need. As we get into the mid-decade, next decade, beginning in 2026, when the first boomers turn 80, we're really going to see that older population really start to take off. So from about 11 million in 2010, we're going to have 19 million of people 80 and over by 2030, and then up to 27 million in 2040. And so you think about going from less than 10 million now to 27 million people 80 and over, and the kind of needs that are in that population. There's going to be a tremendous increase in the kind of supportive housing that we're going to need. So the good news is, while the magnitude of that issue is really large, it is mostly going to be coming about a decade or more from now. So we do have time to prepare, but it's really important to begin now because it's not something that you're going to be able to solve overnight. Then thinking about how people's needs evolve with age, this chart shows the incidence of different types of disabilities, again, by these age groups. And so on the left-hand side, we have cognitive issues, issues with memory and decision-making, And then self-care, such as dressing and bathing, independent living, which is doing errands, paying bills, and other activities of independent living, and then mobility, which relates to climbing stairs or walking, whether you have serious difficulties or not. You can see from those orange and yellow bars, while there's an incidence of those in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, when you hit the 80s, those green bars, the incidence really becomes quite pronounced. So among those in 80 and over, 1 in 5 have cognitive issues or limitations in self-care. More than 1 in 3 have limitations of independent living. More than 40% have mobility issues. So across, when we're talking about that 80 and over population, there's going to be tremendous need for housing that accommodates those issues, those needs, and also supportive services. So again, if you think back to that chart of the projection of population over time, that's mostly going to come a decade from now, but it's already starting to increase. And then the far right-hand side, the other issue that becomes more pronounced with age is that of isolation, of living alone. As people lose their partners and their spouses, they're much more likely to be living on their own. They're much more likely to, if they have issue of a disability, to not have that caregiver in the home, all of which increases the risk of isolation. And you can see by the time, again, 80 and over, more than a third of individuals are living alone. In terms of the financial issues, there's a real tendency for incomes to decline, obviously, as you leave the workforce. And it's also a democratic process. If we look on the left-hand side, you'll see that these are comparing median household incomes by race and ethnicity, as well as by age. And so for people 50 to 64 in their last years of the normal course of a working life, whites and Asians have much higher median household incomes than blacks and Hispanics. As both groups, all those groups enter into the retirement ages, those household incomes contract quite a bit, down to $40,000 for whites and Asians, and less than $30,000 for blacks and Hispanics. But then about the far right, when we're talking about the 80 and over population, where more and more people are relying on single sources of income, those differences really basically are greatly diminished. So all these households have household incomes between $20,000 and $25,000 a year, the typical household. So again, those financial pressures mount as people age, and they become much more common across a wide swath of demographic groups. The other issue the report delves into has to do with housing and financial security. The first thing to keep in mind is what share of households own their homes, what are owners versus renters, the mix. And this is comparing, again, those 3 age groups and looking at 2 points in time, 2005, around the peak of the homeownership rate, to 2013. The first thing to take away is the fact that homeownership rates are generally very high for older households. They're about 80% or more for people who are 65 to 79. They decline somewhat among those 80 and over, part of which reflects the fact that this is a cohort that didn't have as much of a homeownership trajectory. This is the kind of Depression-era babies who were not as likely to own homes as others were. But partly it's also the fact that as you age, you're more likely to return to renter housing, even if you are a homeowner. So mostly when we think about older households, we're thinking about a large majority of them are going to be in homes they own and homes that they profess a desire to age in place in. But the other issue, I think, is that for the left-hand side, the 50 to 64-year-olds, and you can see that that was the group that really did see a significant decline in home ownership as a result of the housing bust. So that home ownership rate went from 80% to about 75% over that 8-year span. And it's a time of life when you're not likely to make that up again. If you've left home ownership and forced out of home ownership at that point in life, it seems less likely that you'll be re-entering home ownership. And so looking forward, I think we're going to expect to see the next generation of people 65 and over to have much lower home ownership rates than the current group. So I think we're going to see more of an increase in renter households going forward than we've had in the past. The other issue that we spend a fair amount of time assessing is the issue of housing cost burdens. So in the housing world, we talk about a housing cost burden being when a household spends more than 30% of their income on housing, which is taken as a benchmark essentially for what leaves you enough money left over to pay for all of life's other necessities. And we also, because that's become so common, talk about severe housing cost burdens when you spend more than half of your income for housing, leaving precious little left over. So in these bars, the green portion are those, the share of households who are severely burdened, and then the yellow are the moderate burdens, 30 to 50%. So the whole height of the bar is the total cost burdened. So on the left, we have renters. And you can see that about half of renters are cost burdened, more than a quarter are severely cost burdened. And this is about the same as it is for all renters. So there's not necessarily a worse cost burden issue among older households, except then among those 80 and over. Again, reflecting the fact that at that point in life, incomes are getting compressed and housing costs aren't necessarily being protected as unless you're in assisted housing, and so you're exposed to higher rent burdens. So nearly 60% of the oldest renters are cost burdened, and about a third are severely cost burdened. And you think about the fact that this is not the median household income is $20,000 to $25,000. So if you're spending 50% of your income on housing, you're not leaving a lot left over for much else. And when we look at what people are spending less on to compensate for this, it's mostly on food and it's on health care, and then also on transportation. So these housing cost burdens have really serious consequences they're related to hunger, to poor health, and to isolation as well. Now, one of the things that we were struck by when we did this is we normally just look at homeowners and renters, but for this group, we broke it out into owners with a mortgage and owners without a mortgage. And so those middle bars are homeowners with a mortgage. And now this is not an apples to oranges comparison. They have different income profiles. They're consuming different housing. But one thing that was notable was that while the cost burdens for owners with a mortgage are less than renters, only about a third cost burden among the 50 to 64-year age group, with age, if you're still carrying a mortgage, those cost burdens rise sharply, and you end up having severe cost burdens among elderly, the oldest owners with a mortgage, as among renters. And then if you look at the far right, owners without a mortgage, cost burdens are fairly rare. Not that they're not existent, and the need to pay property taxes and insurance can be very high, and particularly in high-cost markets, and certainly an issue. But relative to the other groups, that dividend of home ownership, we think about the wealth that you accumulate as a homeowner as something you can tap. Well, the way people mostly tap it is by living rent-free in their older years. And from this, we see that it's really a substantial benefit. One of the concerns is that middle group, owners with a mortgage, is growing. So this is looking at households 65 and over, and those bars are the share of owners with mortgage debt. So if we go back to 1992, about 17–18% of 65-year-old and older homeowners were still paying off a mortgage. So the vast majority own their home free and clear. And over time, that share is just marching upward. So now it's 4 out of 10 people in that age group are still paying off a mortgage. You know, and I think about my own situation, you know, where we've had mortgage rates dropping, and I'm worried about my kids in college and how I'm going to pay for those things. And so when opportunities come to refinance, I've been refinancing and refinancing. And when we did this chart, I looked at this and I said, I'm going to be that group. You know, I refinanced when I was 50, and I took out a 30-year mortgage and didn't stop to think, so that means I'm paying it off in 80. And you think, well, I'll find an opportunity to pay it off. And next thing you know, you're 65 and you're retiring, and your income's going down, and that's not the time to pay it off. And there's a lot of ways in which I think we need to be aware of these to individually plan ahead as well. On the right-hand side, you can see also what's happening is that the average loan-to-value ratio is also going up. So it's more people with debt and more people carrying more debt. And so I think we're going to really see is that as we move forward with my generation hitting retirement, more stressed homeowners and not just more stressed renters who've always been stressed. The other key issue about renters and owners is just the amount of wealth they have to be able to tap. And so this chart has a lot of numbers on it. It's showing the distribution of wealth for homeowners and renters. I've highlighted in the middle the medians just to focus on the typical homeowner, typical renter. And this includes all households 50 and over. So the total wealth of a typical homeowner is a little more than $250,000, $267,000. And you can see that a lot of that comes from home equity, but not all. So homeowners as a class have a lot of wealth to tap. But if you look at the median renter only has $6,000 in wealth. And if you look across that distribution, you know, at the 10th percentile, it's actually the median renter's in debt. 25th percentile, they barely have a savings account. So really, the difference between owners and renters, in part due to home ownership, but in large part due to other investments, is tremendous in terms of wealth. And again, when we look at choices later in life for housing that requires a high degree of services, renters, by this lack of wealth, are going to be severely constrained. So when we look at, I mentioned that the renter households make only about 20% or so of older households. There is a tendency for those to likely to be growing as homeownership rates have fallen. One of the things we looked at is, okay, so if we have a lot of low-income renters, how well are they being served by assisted housing, and what's the demand for that likely to be over time? So on the left-hand side is the green and yellow bars are the numbers of very low-income elderly households. Elderly is a concept used in most federal housing programs in terms of age eligibility for age-restricted housing. It's 62 and over, so slightly different than what we've used elsewhere. But this shows that, basically that very low income, under 50% of area median income, again, a common income cutoff, has gone from a little more than 3 million to about 3.9 million of those households who are renters who are eligible, potentially eligible for assistance. The green portion is the share that actually get that assistance. So as of 2011, it's about 1 in 3 elderly renters eligible for assistance got assistance, which is only slightly higher than it is for the overall low-income population, which is about 1 in 4, about 25%. So the fact that we have some housing set aside for the elderly means they do slightly better, but it's the difference between the horrible and the miserable, as Woody Allen would say. You're either 1 in 33% or 27%. So most are left to fend for their own. And of those who don't get rental assistance, the incidence of worst-case needs, which HUD defines as either paying more than half your income for housing or living in severely inadequate housing, is 60%. So if you get this assistance, then you're going to have an ability to manage your finances, be in a decent housing. And if you don't, and you're in the market, you're really in a very difficult position. Now, on the right-hand side, we estimate from our own household projections what the number of very low-income renter households, elderly renter households, is likely to be over the next 2 decades. So we project at the Joint Center, holding current homeownership rates constant, and a whole other series of assumptions about population and headship, what the renter household population will look like. To that, we said, well, just assume that the distribution by income, the share of those households who are very low income holds the same. By approximation, what does it say about how many more eligible elderly renter households will we have? And you can see by 2030, we're going to have about 6.4 million households eligible compared to the 3.9 today. So if we just wanted to keep pace with having 1 in 3 get housing assistance, we're going to have an increase of about 900,000 assisted households. And today we're helping about 1.4 million. And to put that in perspective, over the course of the recession, trying to ramp up housing assistance, to the extent we have tried to ramp up housing assistance to deal with the after effects of the recession, we've increased overall the number of assisted households by 200,000. So a 900,000 increase would be just a tremendous increase in something kind of beyond the pale for where we are today. And so if you think about the fact that we're going to have elderly households in the rental market on their own, the amount of demand for assistance and the amount of need is really going to be growing quite substantially. So the other issue we looked at is the issue of accessibility needs in the stock. How well suited is the current housing stock to be able to meet the needs of a population that's going to have ever-increasing number of people 80 and over with various disabilities. So in terms of universal design features, we identified 5 features that are taken as helpful in making homes accessible. These include single-floor living, so you have a bedroom and a bathroom on one floor so you don't have to navigate stairs interior to the unit. Having accessible electrical controls so that if you're in a wheelchair, you can reach outlets and switches from the chair. No-step entry, so you don't have to navigate stairs to get into or out of the unit. And then having lever-style handles on doors and faucets so that if you have arthritis, you don't have to navigate knobs. And then having extra-wide hallways and doorways to accommodate wheelchairs. And so from this, looking at the current housing stock, you can see that single-floor living is the most common. Particularly in the South and West, there's more ranch houses. And so about 3/4 of the existing housing units have that feature. The other 2 common features are accessible electrical controls and no-step entries. And then the lever-style handles and extra-wide hallways and doors are fairly uncommon. So at some level, you say, okay, well, overall, we score fairly well on some of these measures. But then if you look and say, well, how many homes have multiples of those features, have all those features? So about 90% have at least 1. Again, most likely that single-floor living. A little more than half have 2. And again, most likely the single-floor living and electrical controls or no-step entry. But once we get to 3 or more, only 1 in 5 housing units have at least 1 in 5. and very few have 4 or more. So in terms of meeting the standards of universal design, overall the housing stock falls well short of those features. And then if we basically look at the kind of need versus supply at some level. So in this chart, the green bars show the share of housing units occupied by people in each of these age groups that have 3 or more of these universal design features. And the yellow bars show the share of households with some disability and therefore in need of those features. So you can see the stock is fairly well lined up overall. This is not whether you actually occupy that unit, but in general we have about 1 in 5 units and 1 in 5 households in the 50s to 60s, a little more of 65 to 79. But by the time we're looking at households in their 80s, where 60% have a disability and only 30% are in a home with those universal design, 3 or more universal design features, there's a growing mismatch. And part of this reflects the fact that the stock doesn't have those options, and part of it reflects the fact that we as individuals aren't preparing and anticipating our needs ahead of time. And so I think part of what we also want to drive home is the need to think about long-term, you as an individual and you as a child to a parent, what are the needs going to be? Because we all, not all, but a large share of people profess a desire to age in their home. And if you're going to age in your home, the decisions you make today are important for the next 2 decades. Very large shares of people who are 75 and over have lived in their home for more than 2 decades. And so when you're making that choice of where to live in your 50s and early 60s, that's when you need to think about these things. I tell this story about my own sister who was undertaking a renovation of her house just before we did this report. And so she was designing her house, making the decision to age in place. She wanted to stay in that home for the next 2 decades. And after she finished the renovations and after I did the report, I looked at her and I said, you didn't do anything to make the home accessible for when you're older. You didn't add a bedroom or a bath on the first floor. You added more stairs. You've got lips between the living room and the dining room that are going to tripping me already. You know, what were you thinking? And she said, well, we didn't really think about it. And then when I pointed it out, she said, well, and my brother-in-law said, well, my parents are 90 and they're fine, which, you know, is a way to, you know, wishful thinking and maybe the grace of good DNA. But it's that kind of, you know, when you're 65 years old and you're remodeling your home, you really ought to have that forethought. And so part of, I think, our solutions is changing that mindset and getting those ideas out there. But there's certainly other ways that we can have policies and programs to encourage more universal design. And hopefully, I think our panels will illuminate some of this, but just to quickly, there are a number of visitability ordinances, which are in creating incentives or mandates for accessibility features in new housing, most often associated with housing that involves some sort of public funding, but there are places where they're also starting to extend that more broadly to the housing stock. Or providing tax incentives for homeowners or builders to add those features when they do undertake remodeling or build new homes. Certainly grants or low-interest loans are another important way for people who are occupying homes who don't have the means to make those investments, to support those investments. And then finally, volunteer efforts such as Rebuilding Together, which is a Habitat for Humanity-like model of helping to have low-income, elderly, disabled, and veterans who are helping remodel their homes. The other dimension is that we look at has to do with social connection and community support. And again, as people age, their ability to maintain ties to their social networks, to maintain ties to service providers, all have important ramifications for their well-being, how happy, safe, and secure they are, and how well they're able to maintain their own active involvement in the community and have the community benefit from their talents. If we look at where people live today, the pie shows the breakdown between suburbs, central cities, and suburbs. So about half of households 50 and over live in suburbs. Another quarter live in non-metropolitan areas. So arguably, you know, very low density, car-centric areas, 3/4 of that older population, again, who express a desire to age in place, and so are likely to be in those communities as they age. If we look at the right-hand side, these are just a couple of measures of the reliance on cars and how that changes with age. Among those 80 and over, nearly a quarter no longer have a car. So you're still likely living in these low-density areas, and now you don't have a car, and how do you maintain that connection? The bar on the right-hand side is from an ARP survey that asked people 50 and over, how often do you miss activities due to limitations on your driving? And about 20% said that they sometimes will miss an activity they want to go to because They don't drive at night, they won't drive in the rain, or other factors. So even having a car is not necessarily an indication of how well you're able to maintain those connections with your community. So issues here in terms of how do we maintain connectivity, in part it relates to having services that support aging in community, such as senior centers, area agents on the aging, meals delivery, home care, and other services that are able to be brought to your home and places that you can get to in your community and connect with those services. The other issue is making sure we have housing options that are close to commercial centers. I have a brother-in-law whose father just gave up his single-family home. He wasn't able to maintain it any longer. And in his suburban community, there were no real options for higher density, low maintenance housing near the center of that town. So he's moved 3 towns away, not that far away, it sounds like, but 3 towns away is 3 towns away, doesn't know anyone in that community, and the transition has been very difficult. So if those suburban communities could have more options of that high density type near the center, you wouldn't have to rupture those ties with your community. And then there's the accessibility of transit and transit alternatives. And one of the challenges we have in looking at the data is, they ask questions, is there a transit stop within a quarter mile? And people, a number of people do have a transit stop within a quarter mile, but there's a question of, can you get to that transit stop? How accessible is it? And does the transit go to a place you want to get to? And when you get there, how accessible is it? And then there's also the question of whether there's transit alternatives if you don't have that transit nearby, such as Parrot transit services and the like. So careful attention to transportation options is important. And then finally, improve pedestrian experience. So even if you live in a centrally located place, how well can you navigate the streets? Are there curb cuts? Is there lighting? Are the crossings safe? Are there resting areas along the way? All those things I think we have greater attention to make sure that even housing well located allows you to maintain that pedestrian connection. And then the other issue has to do with linking housing and long-term supports and services. And again, once we're 80 and over, those incidents of those need for assistance in maintaining independence become more significant. And whether or not you can get those has both important implications for whether you can maintain your independence, stay in the community, and also has important implications for the cost to society, because the alternative to living at home, living in institutional care, can be quite expensive. Just a few points here in terms of what's the trends in this area. One is just that the vast majority of older households who do have disabilities live in the community. So among people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s with a disability, 95% are able to live in the community, that is in their own home, non-institutionalized care. And even in those 80 and over, it's 87% are living in the community. So there is a really high share staying in the community. And in fact, the trend has been more towards living in the community. If we look at the nursing home population, it's declined by 20% over the 2000 to 2010 decade, even at a time when that older population was growing, in part reflecting increased alternatives such as independent living and assisted living to keep you from those higher levels of care. The other thing we had to think about is the fact that most people actually have gotten this care informally through family members. So if you look at people who need assistance with care in their home, 2/3 of them rely exclusively on family members for that, often a spouse or partner or a child, and if it's a child, usually a daughter. Only 9% of people do not rely on family at all and rely purely on paid care. So there's incredible reliance on family to provide this assistance. But we're looking at, going forward, much less family to draw upon. AARP has done an assessment and said in 2010, the average person 80 and over has 7 family members they could potentially draw upon, between a spouse or a child or a sibling. Looking out to 2040, that ratio is going to drop to 4 and 1. And so that many fewer people to draw upon. I look at my own situation. My elderly mother, the last few years, was at the late phase of her life and needed a lot more supportive services that she herself couldn't afford, but she had 5 kids. And we were all situated to be able to provide that financial support and to provide the other kinds of emotional and other supports that she needed. And I tell you, it was great to have 5 because it would have been really difficult without 5. And then I look at my own situation and say, well, I had 3 kids, which is good. Only 1 daughter, and I think the literature is pretty clear that daughters are much more supportive. And then, my other siblings who have 1 child are looking at it and saying that ratio doesn't look good to them. So, I think that this is an issue we have to think about ourselves, but as a society, we have relied extensively on family support networks. And we're not going to be able to rely on those support networks. And what does that say about people who don't have those networks, and what are we going to do to support them? The issues here also have to do with the cost of that care. So this is an estimate of what it would cost per month on median for the kind of supportive services you'll need to stay in your home. So adult daycare could be as much as $1,500 a month. Homemaker services and home health aides, $2,500 a month. Assisted living, $3,500 a month. Now, we did a report. We look at this and say, okay, if you're a homeowner and you have that median wealth we talked about earlier, about $267,000, you can support yourself at home, for a fairly long time with these kind of supportive services. But if you're a renter and you have $6,000, you have a month or two of this kind of support, and then you've gone through all of your savings. So again, I think really points to the fact that as hard as it is for homeowners and the worries we have about making sure they can age in home and age in community, renters are really that much worse off. And a number of things we need to think about in terms, yeah.
I just want to note that those figures are way off for this part of the country.
So,
Good luck finding assisted living.
so Jen, it's the Genworth Cost of Care Survey, and it's a median. Now, I tell you that, so my mother was in assisted living here, and that she went through various levels of care, and she started out at about $4,500, and by the end, she was at $7,500. So it's,
I'm not saying this is wrong. I'm just saying this part of the country, those figures would all be much higher.
much higher, right. And there's obviously a range of quality and others. It reflects both real estate costs and it reflects labor costs, right? And so both of those things factor in. And if you're in New York, it's going to be very different than if you're in Des Moines. But it's so these are, you're right. I mean, these, as startling as these might be for some people, they're only the beginning of the story. So just to say some of the things we need to think about in terms of expanding affordable housing with long-term supportive services. I'm sure we'll hear about it, but things like the HUD Section 202 program, which is one of the primary ways this has been provided in the past, is currently not adding and has a stock that's very old and in need of investment. And so we're doing very little, essentially nothing, to add through those federal programs to what is going to be a desperate need. There are a number of nonprofits who are looking at linking long-term services to existing affordable housing complexes, and particularly since many of these are turning into naturally occurring retirement communities. So there's some potential there. Again, on a scale that's going to be fairly small. And the big issue really will be whether or not there are Medicaid supports for aging in place. The use of state waivers. Ruth was talking about today a state New York program that's even going beyond the federal waivers into undertaking their own investments in housing with supporting services. And I think the real potential here to deal with this is to tackle the housing issues through savings from the healthcare system, because the healthcare system is so expensive. And the potential for savings there as a means of paying for this offers some hope, although the hope requires breaking down silos and the like. That is not an easy thing to do. So where does this leave us? This basically, I think what we lay out are the fact that these challenges are substantial. I joke that people refer to us as the Joint Center for Gloom and Doom, because our job is often to kind of raise the specter of these horrible challenges, and we don't do enough to point to the hope. And so I think there is a hope. There are good ideas. And hopefully that this report is helping to spur the kind of debate and identification of things we can do. Because the good news is that there is time to prepare. Now, certainly there are many older household seniors who are in difficult conditions today, but the growth of that is really going to take off much more a decade from now. And it's going to require a lot more effort by government, at all levels, by nonprofits, by the private sector, and as I've talked about, by individuals, and changing your mindset and taking steps to prepare and being supportive of the kind of policies we need to prepare, whether in thinking about your community and how well suited it is to you as you age, and as well as for younger people across the age spectrum. And one of the things we looked at in this report is the question of, at the policy levels, is really the fact that the rubber hits the road at the community level. It's at the community level that supply of housing, the delivery of services, and what's available really comes to the fore. And when we looked at what communities are going to be addressing this, we mapped out in 1990 the population at the county level that was 50 and over. So back in 1990, if you look at those, the green areas, they have less than a quarter of the population is 50 and over. The yellows between 25 and 39, and very few places had 50 and over population that's 40% or higher. And you can see that places in Florida, some places in the Plain States, out in Arizona, those kind of retirement areas were the few places that had that level of concentration of older households. Well, we fast forward 20 years, the country has changed remarkably, and those green areas have essentially diminished, and those red areas have expanded. Certainly still in Florida, a lot of rural areas are seeing a much older population, but it's areas throughout the country, and the rest of the country is largely yellow. And so, what we're seeing now, I think, is that this is an issue that's really going to be quite ubiquitous and quite universal, and one that places all around the country need to begin to think about. And so what we've drawn you here today to begin to think about that. And so what we're going to do now is turn to a couple of panels of people working on these issues in the field to try to address them. The first panel we have will be moderated by Ann Forsyth and looking at issues around designing homes and communities that are age-friendly. And then we'll turn to one that will look at the policies and programs that we can act. So with that, let me turn it over to Ann.